Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story: an encounter with a Wendigo. At 1 minute to midnight, I took out the shot glass and put it beside the bottle of Jägermeister. I don't drink anymore after what happened to Pop. The one exception is the first day of September. The house is dark except for the warm glow of the 3 bulbs above the dining room table. I rub my tongue against the inside of my cheek. My mouth always goes dry. The only sound is the incessant ticking of the wall-mounted clock. At midnight, the soft bell sounds, a miniature version of church bells. I fill the glass and hold it aloft for a second and swallow with a deep breath. The subtle burn wins its way into my throat and stomach. I wash the shot glass by the light of the moon shining through the kitchen window. Loretta wouldn't mind my drinking, but a used shot glass beside the sink raises questions. And I never like to talk about it. All these years later, I still have nightmares. What I saw up on that mountain left a greater impression than any other event in my life. More than my children being born and my father drinking himself into an early grave. Loretta tells me I should talk about it, that it would help. She might be right. She always is. So here goes. I joined the park ranger service right out of school, and it was a perfect fit. I took to academics like a fish to the desert, and the outdoors always called. I passed my time in school daydreaming of the weekend and hiking or fly fishing with Pop. In the summer of '89, I was stationed in the Appalachians. Our jurisdiction encompassed trails leading all the way up the mountain. Up there, the spruce thin out and clouds hang heavy even in fine weather at the base. I spent the summer clearing fallen branches from the walking trails after a couple of vicious storms over the winter. It was hack work reserved for the junior, but the truth of it was I didn't mind. The peak of the summer heat was spent and visitor numbers dropped as the weather began to turn. Persistent drizzle had kept me desk-bound for the morning, and we were about to get lunch when he burst through the door. He let out a moan and collapsed to the floor. Stanley leaned down and propped him in a seated position. Water dripped from his shoulder-length hair. His limbs hung limp by his side. I handed Stanley a cup of water. Stanley used his index finger to push down his chin. When the water hit his tongue, the man tensed and his eyelids flicked open. He flailed his limbs and knocked the glass from Stanley's hand. The glass shattered on the floor, but the man paid it no mind. "It is out there," he said. "What is?" The man half-turned and gripped Stanley's shirt and made balls with his fists. He repeated himself, pausing after each word. "It is out there." He started to sob. He released his grip on Stanley and buried his face in his hands. We lifted him onto a chair, and he pressed his face against the table and bawled. I grabbed the rucksack he had dropped to the floor. On the bottom right was a name tag behind a plastic sleeve. Lenny Porter from San Diego. There was a number at the bottom. "I'll make the call," Stanley said. When Stanley returned, Lenny was sat up staring blankly at the wall with red eyes. His face was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in a week. Stanley closed the door. "I spoke to your father." Lenny didn't acknowledge the words. He sat motionless and unblinking. Stanley shuffled across to where I was sitting and pressed his palms on the table. "Lenny left San Diego 2 weeks ago with a couple of friends. They planned to spend a month hiking the trail north. The father gave me 2 names, Freddie and Sabrina." When he heard their names, Lenny leaned over and picked up his backpack. He rummaged frantically until he pulled out a stack of Polaroids. He flicked through the photographs and then slapped one on the table. Stanley and I leaned over. Flanking a fitter and healthier Lenny were what must have been Freddie, tall and wearing a baseball cap, and Sabrina, shorter and wearing a bright yellow top with an almost fluorescent blue belt pulling the fabric tight around her waist. Lenny fingered the photo, and tears welled in his eyes. What happened to them? He sobbed and shook his head. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Stanley took a map down from the wall and pushed it in front of Lenny. "We are here. Where did you last see them?" Lenny blinked away tears and concentrated. He squinted at the map and pressed his index finger down and tapped it. Stanley took a pencil from his breast pocket and marked the map with a cross. "I'll notify the police. Get the truck ready to go." During training, they told us about search and rescue operations. The Rangers are the first responders. It was part of the job. Twisted ankles and wandering off the trail and getting lost are not uncommon and no reason to get the police involved. But this felt different. I secured the gear in the truck and Stanley appeared, flanked by a police officer in his early 30s. "Harry is hitching a ride. His partner will take care of Lenny." We drove up the trail for about 15 minutes with the truck until it grew too narrow and treacherous. We split up the gear between us and set out on foot. Our destination was high up the mountain and far away from the trails. It was almost as if the trails deliberately avoided the area. We hacked our way through the thick forest. How had they ended up all the way out here? Stanley checked his watch constantly as we climbed. He wanted to get there before dark. I figured we would be lucky if we did. Stanley and Harry talked like old friends, asking about each other's wives and children. The park rangers are in effect an extension of law enforcement. It made sense to be friendly with the police, and living in a small mountain town made it almost inevitable. I like that. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Stanley checked the map. "Almost there. Get your torches." "All right." Harry reached into his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. I did the same. "Do you know what's up this way?" Stanley said. I shook my head. "Somewhere up here is an old cabin. Hunters used it as a base back when you could still hunt up this way. The cross our friend Lenny put on the map is just about on top of it. Let's see if we can get there before there's no light left." We didn't make it by dark. Twilight gave to night with little warning. Soon we were relying on the light from our torches. Being on a trail in the sunshine lends a sense of security up here, even when you are alone. Now, surrounded by black and with the trail long behind us, an uneasiness grew in my stomach for the first time. Stanley paused and swept his torch. He muttered something under his breath. Harry took a few steps to the right, lowering his head and squinting. "There it is," he said. At the farthest reaches of Harry's torchlight, the cabin emerged from the woods. Stanley tapped Harry on the shoulder. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." The cabin should have been a source of comfort, but it only added to my unease. The roof was half caved in and trees encroached on all sides, gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. The structure looked like it belonged more to the forest than to man. The only door hung askew on warped and rusted hinges. 2 windows had long ago lost their glass. Stanley shouldered open the door with a grunt. Leaves and branches covered the floor, blown in through the open windows and roof. We dumped the gear inside. Stanley took out a lantern and tied it to a horizontal branch a few paces from the front door. He flicked it on and the light shone bright. If there was anyone lost nearby, they could not fail to see it. We split up and entered the forest, guided by our torches. Stanley instructed us to go no further than the reach of the lantern. It was our lighthouse on the horizon. The wind blew in fresh from the north. I buttoned up my jacket against the cold. The beam from the torch was strong, but aside from the narrow cone of light, the forest was a deep and full dark. Stanley and Harry called out the names of the 2 missing, Freddie and Sabrina. I did the same. Every few steps I stopped and listened. The forest was alive with the scurrying of animals and insects going about their business, and the constant rustling of the wind through the leaves. It was hopeless. This was needle in the haystack stuff. Freddie or Sabrina could be unconscious on the ground a few feet to my left, and I would never see them. We should camp and wait for first light. Harry's voice cut through the night, louder and with urgency. I skipped towards the sound as fast as I dared. The two torchlights of Harry and Stanley played close together, the beams of light trained on the forest floor. "You might not want to see this," Stanley said as I came up behind them. It was too late. By the light of the torches I saw him, flat on his back, arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. I almost gagged when I saw his face. The left side caved in, a red, bloody mess fragmented with the white of the skull. The right side was intact, one green eye staring up, wide and unblinking. The remainder of the face had an almost serene expression. It was not the look of fear that you would expect from someone about to have half their face crushed. No skin remained below the neck, the contents of his torso picked so clean I could see his full spine. "What did that?" I stammered. I didn't get an answer. Stanley fished the Polaroid from his pocket and studied it under the torchlight. He handed it to Harry. "It's him. It's Freddie." Harry jumped and swung his torch out into the woods. "I swear I heard someone talking out there," Harry said. "We've been calling out their names too." "No, it wasn't that. It sounded like whispering. It's the wind through the trees." Harry didn't look convinced. He called out the name of Sabrina and listened. Only the sounds of the forest. Stanley shushed him. "There's nothing we can do for the boy now. Let's get back to the cabin and radio down the news." Stanley took a few quick steps towards the cabin and motioned for us to follow. He seemed agitated. I didn't blame him. I followed on his heels. Harry lingered, searching the woods with his torch until he too fell in behind. The inside of the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Out of the wind and removed from the mangled corpse of Freddie, my mind processed the sight. I had gutted my fair share of fish, but this was different. I put my hand to my stomach and swallowed hard. I was overcome with a compulsion to repeat my unanswered question. What could have done that? Before I could, Harry gave us some more bad news. There was no response on the radio, only static. It wasn't surprising. The cabin sat in a depression between the peak we crested on our way in and the taller peak beyond. "We have to go back," I said. Harry shook his head. "Not in the dark, and not when there's someone still out there." "We don't know if that girl is dead or alive," Stanley said. "I heard her." "You heard a whisper is what you said. And if she was there, she would have come to the light. She'll come to the lantern, and we'll wait for her." Harry threw out his arms in protest. Stanley sighed. "If she's dead, then we'll find her in the light of morning. If she's alive and nearby enough to whisper in our ears, then she'll come to us." Two rectangles of light shone through the open windows from the lantern outside, but the front room of the cabin still had dark, shadowy corners. Stanley took a second lantern and tied it to an old light fixture hanging from the ceiling. The room lit up as if under sunlight, but a cold light that gave the room a bare and unwelcome feel. I busied myself clearing a space on the floor beside the black pot-belly stove at the rear of the room. Stanley and Harry stood as statues, staring up at the wall behind me. I turned. Etched in black, stood onto the blank wall was some kind of monster, long-limbed and with an elongated skull. It stared back at us through white blobs left clear of black. I took a step back and almost stumbled. "What is that?" I didn't need an answer. You don't live and work up in the mountains here without hearing the stories. Stories told dismissively by daylight, Like you would talk about the monsters you imagined hiding in your closet as a kid. By night and around a campfire, the stories take on a graver tone, and the name of the monster is only ever whispered. Wendigo. Of course, I had never seen one, but if I had to imagine what one might look like, the painting in soot taking up the full height of the wall of the cabin was an exact match. I waited for one of the two men behind me to dismiss what we saw drawn on the wall, to make light of it and crack a joke. Neither did. Stanley uttered a simple instruction. No one goes outside without a weapon. Our shadows danced on the walls. The lantern hanging from the ceiling did not move. Stanley leaned and looked out the window. The lantern hanging from the tree branch swung back and forth like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. There was wind tonight, but not enough to do that. Stanley bent down and fished a rifle from the bag. My heart beat like a drum in my ears. And then something else. Whispers. What sounded like the whispers of a girl, entreating us, inviting us out into the darkness of the forest. Stanley inched open the door with the muzzle of his rifle. He stepped through the gap and watched the lantern on the tree come to a rest. He stood beside the lantern and searched the corners of the forest illuminated by the light. Nothing moved. Harry unclipped the leather strap on his belt and drew a pistol and went to the doorway. I felt naked and exposed with my hands empty. I took a step backwards, the Wendigo drawn and soot looming large behind and burning a hole in the back of my head. A shadow flashed through the trees and Stanley swung the muzzle of the rifle and shot, the crack piercing the night. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and flicked it from side to side, searching for movement. The lantern boobed up and down. With a rush, a long-limbed creature dropped onto Stanley from above. He screamed and wrenched the rifle around, but had it knocked from his grip. Harry fired 2 shots, and the creature let out a wail. It bounded towards the door, and Harry slammed it shut. He pointed the pistol to the closed door and emptied the chamber. Harry took a step back and shot me a glance. Through the whole ordeal, I had not moved. I had barely breathed. Was it dead? Was Stanley okay? The window. I screamed. The long, thin fingers of the creature wrapped themselves around the inside of the window frame. Then the head appeared, uncannily human-like, but distorted and disfigured. The chin elongated, and the teeth like razors and drenched in blood. Its eyes white and piercing, just like the etching on the wall. Harry grabbed me by the arm and hauled me into the back room of the cabin. He slammed shut the flimsy door. The back room was windowless, and the only light was a thin strip at the base from the lantern in the front room. We crouched together, our shoulders pressed against the door. We listened. The light patter of footsteps, 2 thin strips of black, interrupted the strip of light at the base of the door. Something stood on the other side. "Come out, it is okay." It sounded like Stanley. Had he killed it? "Come out." Harry straightened and I grabbed his shoulder. "Don't open the door," I whispered. "They say a Wendigo can imitate those it kills." My hand brushed against Harry's back and knocked the flashlight from his jacket pocket. I fumbled in the darkness until I found it, and I flicked it on. I scanned the room for something, anything we could use as a weapon. I walked away from the door and kicked at the twigs and leaves on the floor. All that was good for was kindling. Something smelled rotten. There must be a dead rat somewhere. "It's Stanley," Harry said. I pointed the torch to him. His eyes were wide and wild. "He must have killed it." He smiled at me and took a step back. The door slammed open and carried with it the rotten stench. What stood in the doorway was not Stanley, but the Wendigo. Harry kneeled before it, breathing in the noxious fumes. I shone the torch onto the creature. Its gray skin pulled tight on a gaunt frame. And then something glinted. A belt buckle. Around the creature's waist was the bright blue belt Sabrina wore in the Polaroid. "Sabrina?" I said. It turned to me and paused, tilting its head to the side. I thought I saw a glimmer of recognition, a brief moment where it knew the name. But then it snarled, its mouth opening wide and dripping with saliva. It wrapped two hands around the neck of Harry and leaned in. I acted instinctively, without thinking. I jumped at the creature, swinging the only weapon I had, the torch. I brought it down on its head with all the strength and adrenaline I had. It bucked and sent me flying into the front room beyond. I threw out my hands against the fall and grabbed the lantern Stanley had hung from the ceiling. It could not bear my weight, and the cord pulled out from the ceiling and I fell with a thud. I jumped up at a burst of warmth from my stomach. The lantern had smashed on impact, and the white-hot filament broke free of its casing. I groaned in pain, and the creature lumbered forwards. I retreated into the corner of the room and pulled my knees up to my chest. It stood over me and opened its mouth, razor-sharp teeth gleaming white. Then the smell of smoke. The creature hopped and then scrambled backwards. The leaves and twigs covering the floor ignited under the heat from the lamp filament. A small flame burst up and the creature covered its face. Fire. It didn't like fire. I crawled forwards and swept as much of the kindling as I could grab onto the flames. The fire grew and the creature screamed. As smoke filled the room, it coughed and spluttered. It made one last effort to come at me, and then retreated out of the room and into the forest. I went to the back room and grabbed Harry. We stumbled out of the cabin, the fire now spreading up the walls and to the roof. Stanley lay below the lantern hung from the tree, unmoving and with a chunk of flesh missing from his throat. We ran into the forest in the opposite direction the creature had gone. We first climbed up to the crest and then back down the mountain. We stumbled our way down by the light of the torch. Adrenaline coursed through our veins, and we imagined that thing right behind us, stalking us in the dark. When we finally crossed a trail, we followed it back down to the ranger station. A team of police and National Guard hiked up to the cabin after the sun rose. The cabin had burned to the ground, the pot-belly stove the only item that survived the blaze. The bodies of Stanley and Freddie were brought down. They said Stanley's flesh had been picked clean down to the skeleton. That was the first day of September, 1989. Sabrina was listed as a missing person, and her father spent a month in the mountains searching for her. But she's gone in every sense that matters. Turned to a Wendigo by hunger for human flesh. She transformed into something unrecognizable from where it began. Around campfires, people still tell stories of the Wendigo. I don't know if they truly believe they are out there, but I know I have seen it. Sometimes there really is a monster in the closet. Second story. There's something wrong with the deer. A few days ago, I was out for a morning hike in my local forest on a trail I had walked 100 times before. It's a 5-mile loop that passed by a creek, and it was just isolated enough to feel like a refreshing sojourn away from the suburbs without being too remote. It was a bit of a surprise to me when I came across a fence about a mile into my walk, right across where the trail normally continued. There was a sign that said something along the lines of government property, no trespassing, and I sighed in annoyance. I'd been down on this very same trail nearly a week prior, and the fence and sign hadn't been there before. I almost turned around, but it was such a nice day, and the trail was so short, I figured it wouldn't be too big of a deal if I just hopped the fence and finished my hike. I could find another route the next time. I didn't see a security camera or anything else like that, so I simply hopped the fence and continued with my walk, annoyed that it may be the last time I would be able to hike on that trail. It's a beautiful area, and I stopped occasionally to listen to the birds or smell the fresh air. After about 2 miles or so, I reached the creek and decided to sit down and enjoy the view. As I took a swig from my thermos of hot tea, listening to the gentle burbling of the nearby stream. I had almost forgotten about the fence. Out in the forest like this, I felt like I was one with the sublimity of nature. Everything was quiet, calm, and serene. After a few minutes, though, I began to feel a little uneasy. It took me a moment to realize why. There were no birds singing. I hadn't noticed at first because the creek was so close by that it provided its own ambient noise. But once I was aware of the birds' absence, the silence was deafening. A couple years back, I had an experience with a mountain lion. It was on a different trail, but in the same general part of the state. I recalled that all the birds had gone quiet, instinctively silencing themselves in the presence of the beast. It had simply come down out of the bushes, walking across the trail before looking at me curiously. Luckily, I had managed to keep my wits about me and succeeded in scaring off the cougar with a combination of yelling and flapping my jacket to make myself look bigger. As soon as it departed, the chirping of birds returned. After that day, I always carried a small air horn with me on my hikes. I reached into my bag and pulled out the air horn, looking around cautiously in search of anything that could be scaring off the birds. I didn't see anything, and was almost on the verge of simply pressing down on the air horn preemptively when I heard a snap far away on my right. Turning cautiously, I strained my eyes to see what could have caused the noise, the air horn at the ready. Knowing what I do now, it is very possible that if I had chosen to use the horn, I wouldn't be here to tell my story. Though at first it blended in with the trees and brush, I noticed the deer rather quickly. I relaxed a little, exhaling in relief as I put the air horn back into my bag with shaking hands. I still felt uneasy though. Even at this distance I could tell that there was something off about the animal, and the birds still hadn't returned. Staying quiet and lying low, I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look at the distant deer. It was a buck, with a beautiful set of antlers. This already struck me as somewhat odd, as most of the bucks around here had long since shed their antlers at this point. Even odder, however, was the structure of the antlers. Rather than two large antlers with multiple points facing upwards, it seemed more like 6 to 10 spikes extending out of the skull. On further inspection, the deer was malnourished, emaciated even, with clumps of fur missing. As I watched, it hobbled feebly on unsteady legs towards the river, lowering its head to drink. My thought was that it must have been suffering from chronic wasting disease, perhaps coupled with a bit of mange. I felt sorry for the animal and with sadness, continued to watch it through my binoculars. Then its antlers twitched. It didn't look like they were going to fall off due to shedding or anything like that. The points moved outwards slightly, like a hand unclenching from a fist. As soon as the antlers twitched, the deer stood up from its drink, eyes wide, almost as if it were standing at attention. As I watched, the now clearly articulated antlers further stretched, bending until the points touched the side of the buck's head. Then they began to push. As I watched in stunned horror, something ripped itself out of the deer's skull with a disgusting crack of splintering bone. The objects I previously thought to be antlers were, in actual fact, the spider-like legs of some sort of horrible monstrosity. My hands were shaking too much to get a clear view, but it was somewhat crab-like in appearance, with sharp mouthparts and beady black eyes. As soon as the creature pulled itself fully free from the skull, the deer's corpse fell down limply into the stream, its bright red blood polluting the fresh water. The antler thing scuttled off rapidly into the tree line, disappearing in an instant. As soon as it was out of sight, I ran as fast as I could down the trail, not stopping until I had jumped over another fence and got back into my car. When I finally arrived back home, I vomited on the side of the road. I called out of work for the next couple days, claiming that I was feeling ill, which, to be fair, I was. I have no possible idea what that thing was. All I do know is that I won't be going on any hikes again anytime soon. Third story. My brother killed a sacred deer. Recently, my little brother got into hunting. The woods and camping were never something I ever enjoyed. I was more of an under a pile of blankets with a book kind of guy. I wanted to support him in his new hobby, so I found myself saying I would go with him and his wife on a weekend hunting trip. The day before we left, I felt a small cold coming on. By the time we got out camp set up and went into the woods to start hunting, I had a fever. My face flushed the gray rainy weather, doing nothing to help it. My brother lent me a rifle even though I never used one before. I decided early on I was not going to shoot anything. The head cold was a good excuse to do so. I was against a tree, sniffling, feeling the effects of my fever when my brother shot something. I heard his wife gasp after something big in the distance thudded to the ground. When I looked over at the both of them, I realized something was very wrong. Their faces pale and in shock of what just happened. At first, I was convinced my brother accidentally shot someone. I looked off through the trees trying to see what collapsed. Spotting a white shape through the bush, I started forwards ready to help while the other two remained frozen to the spot. I arrived first to look at what my brother killed. To my relief, it was a deer. Pure white, and I stood in awe of the beautiful coat of fur. I've never seen a white deer before, and a pang of pain came to my chest over the fact it was dead. Finally, my brother and his wife walked over, still pale. "What is that?" he asked in a hushed tone. I looked at him, confused about the question for a few seconds. "It's a deer." How could he not see that? Looking over to studied it again, trying to see what he meant. When my eyes landed on the deer's face, I finally started to understand the gravity of this situation. I know it had antlers, but for the life of me, I can't remember what the face looked like. My memory was a blur of white. While staring right at it, my brain refused to actually see it. I took a few steps back then, scared out of my mind, and started to think my fever was messing up my head. "That doesn't make any sense," I said in a low voice between some coughs. The deer in front of us was special, beyond special, and my brother shot it. I looked at the wound that killed the poor thing to see pearl-shaded blood staining the wounds. My stomach twisted in regret, and I felt like I was about to sob. I turned my head away, unable to keep looking at it. "What should we do?" his wife, Kathy, asked in a shaking voice. "We shouldn't let the meat go to waste," my brother commented. I felt the entire forest fell still at his comment. It was as if the air itself stopped moving. It revolted me. It was terrible enough this creature was dead, and my brother wanted to disrespect it further. It knew it was natural for animals to eat each other, and logically it would be a waste to not eat this deer. However, I just instinctively knew this creature was never meant to be eaten. It was something that existed outside the natural order. Something powerful and yet fragile enough to be killed by a single bullet. "Are you crazy?" I hissed at him. Looking down at the white shape, I shook my feverish head. "We'll let the forest take it." He reluctantly agreed. I put down the borrowed rifle and started to pick up fallen branches. My brother doing the same. Kathy gathered up wildflowers, and in a short, while we covered the deer as a sign of respect. We could never take back killing it, but we could show remorse. Without a word, we left the creature behind, and with a heavy weight in our chests. When we arrived back into camp, I was feeling so ill I turned in the moment we got back. I bundled myself up in blankets and fell into a deep sleep, only waking to drink some water to ease my dry throat. My slight cold turned into a full-blown flu, and I was in no condition to walk out of the woods. When I woke again, It was morning but still gray and cold. "How are you doing?" Kathy asked me when I came out of my tent. "Awful. What's the plan?" I felt like my head was going to explode and my entire body was weak. She walked over and gave me a cup of hot tea, which was very much appreciated. "We'll stick around until you feel better and the weather clears up. We should get you out of these woods, but it would nearly kill you if you walked through the rain to get to the truck. Just stay inside your tent and keep warm and dry. You brought some books, right?" I nodded, sipping at my tea. That sounded like a good enough plan. I hoped my fever would only last another day and we could leave. What happened the day before really was freaking me out. The forest around us felt hostile. The wind howled through the trees and I suppressed a shudder. I took my tea back inside the tent and got wrapped up in blankets once more, but not feeling any warmer. The wind kept howling outside the tent. I prayed my flimsy tent would hold if a storm came rolling in. The rest of the day, I drifted between trying to read and sleeping. I normally never got sick, so it was hitting me extra hard. When Kathy tried waking me to eat some soup, I was in such a deep sleep I didn't even stir, so she left me alone to offer it later. The next day I was feeling much better and starving from not eating much the past 2 days. I had my backpack in my tent, so I opened it to find the hidden snacks I stashed away. I ate an entire box of oatmeal bars before getting outside my tent. When I went outside, the rain cleared up, but everything was still damp outside. Kathy was outside trying to keep the fire going. "Are you feeling any better?" she asked me, looking and sounding exhausted. "A bit. I think we could leave sometime today if it doesn't start raining again," I offered. She looked between me and her tent, worried. Clearing her throat, she shook her head. "James isn't feeling well. I think he caught your cold. Let's see how he is in a few hours." I felt bad that my brother was sick and now suffering through what I just did. It would delay us leaving, but there was nothing I could do about it. I saw that we were out of firewood and I needed to get some air. "I'll get us some wood. It'll give me something to do. I'll check on him in a few hours. Make sure he's eating." Kathy gave me a grateful smile. From how bad she looked, I wondered if she'd gotten sick too. I left into the woods, trying my best to find anything that wasn't too damp to burn. I found some sticks hidden under leaves and logs that should be dry enough. I was the type to get lost easy, so I needed to stick around the camp. After I collected an armful of good enough wood, I was about ready to head back when something out of the corner of my eyes made me stop. On a bush was a few drips of shimmering liquid. I walked up to it to get a better look, not understanding what I was looking at. I was drawn away by the sound of retching off towards the camp. Forgetting about the strange liquid, I started back to check up on my brother and Kathy. When I arrived back, the rain started again, making it too wet for us to start the fire back up. Kathy was looking pale and chilled down to the bone. I wished the cold, damp weather would pass so we could finally leave. I started to wonder if I should just take my brother's truck and get some help. My fever hadn't gone down entirely, and we parked so far away. I feared I would get too ill if I braved the hike through the woods. "Is everything all right?" I asked. I put the wood away, covering it with plastic, hoping for it to stay dry. Kathy looked at me, a worried expression on her face. Before she could answer, my brother came out of his tent. It should have been impossible, but he looked paler than Kathy, his skin nearly void of any color. I decided then I would try to get some help. We needed to get the hell out of those woods. "James, give me your keys, please," I said, holding out my hand for him to give me his truck keys from his pocket. He looked over at me, as if I was speaking a different language. Shaking his head, he took a sip of water from a flask Kathy handed to him. She looked scared stiff. James felt different. It was the way he was moving and not really looking at us.
"No.
Just give me another few hours to sleep. Then we'll all go. I never should have given in. I slowly brought my hand back, trying to think of an argument. Truthfully, I was frightened to go into the woods alone. Just a few more hours. Then we wouldn't even pack up our gear. We would just leave. James took Kathy's hand, and they went back into their tent. Not being able to think of anything else to do, I went back into mine to get dry and warm. I was going to finish the last 100 pages of a book to give my brother time to sleep. I drifted off while I was reading. One moment I had a book in my hand, and the other I was waking up in a pitch darkness. I sat up, confused at what time it was. Slowly my eyes adjusted and I could see a hint of light coming through the tent. Slipping back into the cold, damp outside world, I looked over to see a very weak fire burning. My brother stood just within the light. I opened my mouth to call out to him, but something felt wrong. I couldn't place it. The air was tense and my muscles started to lock up. Hearing me coming from my tent, my brother turned to look over at me. He still looked pale as death. His face was the same, but I just knew in that moment I was no longer looking at my brother. He took a step towards me, an unknown purpose in his stride. I ran. Without any plan, I ran off into the woods trying to get away from whatever he become. I was only running for a few minutes when I saw the light of a fire between the trees. It was faint, but I ran towards it praying someone would help. I didn't think anyone was camping so close to us and was thankful for it. I ran into the clearing, but my blood froze in my veins. It was not a new campsite. It was ours. I just ran back around, even though I was positive I ran straight. My brother stood by the dying coals, the orange light shining in his eyes. I ran again. It was dark and the woods was just a maze of trees. It was understandable I got turned around. A few more minutes of running and I came crashing into our campsite again. In a blind panic, I just kept going. No matter what direction I took, I would always end up running towards our camp. My brother standing, silently watching me attempting and failing to escape. When I couldn't run anymore, I collapsed gasping for air. I didn't understand what was going on. All I knew was I could no longer leave. Please, I begged the pale figure. It was far too late to save my brother, but if there was even a hint of him left, he would let me and Kathy leave. His face was going out of focus. For whatever reason, my brain was refusing to see what it truly looked like. Let me and Kathy leave. I sat on the cold ground, shaking in fear. Deep down I knew my brother wasn't changing into something beyond my understanding simply because he shot a strange deer. My suspicions I could not bear to say out loud was confirmed by him when he finally spoke in a rasping voice. I cannot let her go. After all, she ate some of it too. My stomach sank and I felt like I was going to be sick. Killing the white deer by accident could be forgiven, but cutting into its body to devour the flesh could not. The thing that was once my brother lunged at me. He grabbed me by the neck as I struggled, desperate to get free. I got as far as the dying fire pit before he held me still. His strength was far beyond my own. I kicked and screamed, trying to pry him away from me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I saw his mouth. Oh God, whatever he became was something no human should ever see. It opened wide with countless teeth shining in the dying firelight. He had turned into something so twisted because of his unforgivable sin. I was only saved because I thought. For a brief moment I saw a white figure behind my brother urging me to fight. I had nothing to lose, so I reached over to the nearby coals. The fear causing me to ignore the pain of grabbing coals and ash to toss into the creature's eyes. He let out a scream of pain and let me go. I wasted no time scrambling free, but paused at the edge of the camp. I watched in horrified fascination as the thing that was once my brother screamed and thrashed around. Sickening cracking sound came from his body as he started to turn from a human form into something completely different, twisted with long, pale limbs. I couldn't stomach the sight. I almost couldn't stand the idea of leaving Kathy behind. She was either already dead or turning into something else inside the tent and out of sight. I felt trapped. I knew if I left I would end back up in the camp again. Off in the distance, I saw a hint of white through the trees, and I ran towards it. As I ran, I heard the monster I left behind screaming at me to stay. This time, instead of looping back around, I noticed a hint of a shimmering liquid on the ground and I followed it. Drop by drop, I kept going until my lungs felt like they were going to burst and my legs burned. The forest around me started to get lighter until I found myself running right into a snow-covered parking lot. I collapsed again, feeling weak and the snow soaked through my jeans. It wasn't the season for snow. The parking lot was right next to the ranger station. When I came running out exhausted, a ranger saw me and came outside to see what was going on. I couldn't keep myself awake until he got to me and passed out in the slush. In the end, they never found James and Kathy. They found our abandoned campsite months ago and assumed us all dead. I could never tell them what really happened because I don't know myself. I don't feel as if this was all a dream, or if my mind just snapped. I'm certain my brother is now something else out there inside the woods. I wonder why I was saved. What creature decided to show me the right way out? Was it the white deer because I didn't eat part of it? Or did it want me to live so I could tell others about what happened? Whatever reason it might be, I'm thankful for my life. If you're ever out hunting, make certain you know what you're about to shoot before you pull the trigger, or else you might make a mistake that is going to change your life forever. Fourth story. Let's discuss Wendigos and how they've gone from the humanoid cannibal monsters of Algonquin legend to the freaky deer cryptids of pop culture. And if we have any Native or First Nations folk here, please do give us your input because as a white British woman I do feel I may be treading on some toes. I first heard of the Wendigo when reading an article several years ago about Wendigo psychosis, what was described as a cultural mass hysteria that occurred when individuals in certain tribes who had committed cannibalism or were facing starvation began to act violently, believing they were Wendigos. This article went on to briefly state the Wendigo legend, and to my understanding the myth was that the Wendigo was one of two entities. 1. A spirit that possessed people suffering from starvation in winter, driving them to commit cannibalism. 2. A person who had indeed resorted to cannibalism and was transformed by their wicked deed, becoming an emaciated humanoid that was unable to satiate their hunger and hunted humans to eat. But over the last couple of years, I've been seeing all sorts of claims that Wendigos are deer-like, look like zombie deer, are humanoids with antlered skulls, or some such amalgamation that usually involves cervine features and antlers. I can't seem to find anything reliable that says this is a traditional or cultural description of the Wendigo. However, I did notice that Wendigos and skinwalkers are often lumped into the same lot, as it were, and skinwalkers are far more varied in appearance. As a skinwalker is an individual able to shapeshift with the use of magic and animal pelts, not unlike a berserker, I suppose, they certainly could have a cervine appearance. The most compelling tales I've read and heard tend to involve canine shapes, but I can't help but think from the things I've read that a skinwalker is more likely to be antlered than a Wendigo. So where has this pop culture image of the antlered Wendigo come from? I invite you to share your knowledge, research, and resources here. My personal theory is that the Wendigo and skinwalker legends have become blurred, causing confusion. Aesthetically, ungulate skulls are particularly creepy, so it also makes sense that artists would enjoy using that imagery in their work, further perpetuating this description. For the record, if anyone is able to share some good information that contradicts my suggestion, I'm open to hearing it and always enjoy learning new information about folklore, myth, and the paranormal. But I've seen plenty of disagreement on what constitutes a Wendigo lately, and I thought it might be a good thing to have an intelligent discussion on the subject. Fifth story. Ain't no deer. Once, and only once, when I was 9 or 10, I spent the summer at my Uncle Pete's farm in the Appalachians. I knew Uncle Pete from our various encounters at birthdays, Christmases, and Thanksgivings, but I had never visited his farm, and I had never spent much time with the strange, silent old man. Despite this, my parents decided that it would be character building for me to help him out for the summer. They were probably motivated by the prospect of a few child-free months. Neither me nor my uncle were particularly happy about the arrangement. The farm lay on a sloping foothill, nestled in a wide open patch of field, surrounded by deep, dense forest. These are the kinds of woodland which are always wet, always damp and mossy and dewy to the touch. The property was pretty small. Aside from the crooked old farmhouse, there was a cowshed, 3 pastures for the cattle, and a large cornfield which spanned the breadth of the forest edge. I became used to waking up early, helping to herd the cows to graze, assisting Uncle Pete in milking. The work was hard. I became perpetually sore and covered in small nicks and bruises as I came at odds with the elements. But I enjoyed the hardship. I enjoyed the rugged landscape and the fresh air and the feeling of a job well done. Sometimes, Pete and I would go on long walks through the woods. Out there, when you are properly and completely isolated, time moves slower. It is only in a forest that you can truly view the cycle of life and rebirth, as mud and rot and weeds sprout new shoots and spores. Even death is not the end in a forest. Dead things still swell and writhe and multiply, constantly rejoining the great intertwining web of the living, breathing wilderness. My uncle and I hardly ever spoke, but we both connected in mutual appreciation for the natural beauty around us. I remember Uncle Pete like that, always quiet. He was a man who never wasted energy on speaking except when absolutely necessary. He would never use words when a grunt or a nod or a vague motion could suffice. He was getting on in age, but he was incredibly tough, like an old sheepdog, grizzled and hardy. I couldn't imagine anything ever disturbing him or knocking him from his calm, solemn stillness. One night, Pete and I were walking back up from the bottom of the southernmost field. A cow had just given birth. I can still remember kneeling in the mud and feeling the bloody, warm mass of the calf in my hands. It was later than usual. Already, the total and enveloping darkness of the mountains had settled in. We were guided by the lights of the farmhouse and the bright full moon. It was as we reached the porch, and I turned to glance at that same moon, that I saw it. A long way off, right at the end of the cornfield, was a black silhouette. Against the pure white backdrop of the moon, it stood at the edge of the tree-line. Although I could make out no features, only its shape, I recognized 4 legs and a broad, powerful set of antlers. I gasped softly, my young self reveling in the complete stillness and size of the creature. I turned excitedly to Pete. "Look, Uncle Pete, is that a deer? Even for a stag, that's pretty big, right?" Uncle Pete wheeled very slowly to squint at where I was pointing. There was a long pause, as he breathed in and out, still staring. The 3 of us, he and I and the black shape, we were motionless together for a moment. Then he replied softly, almost under his breath, "Ain't no deer." He turned around again and entered the house without looking back. I didn't even have time to question what he had said. Although I was confused, Uncle Peter was rarely the kind of man to explain himself, and I accepted that he knew these hills and everything in them like the back of his hand. I shrugged it off and I followed him into the house, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark silhouette so boldly outlined against the moon, still standing so perfectly still. Briefly, it was removed from my line of sight, and when I had reached the kitchen window, it was gone, disappeared back into the trees. From my bed, I could see across the landing directly into Uncle Pete's room. That night, I awoke at some point, late into the night. As my eyes flitted open, I saw Pete. He was sitting in his old rocking chair, beside the window of his bedroom. In his hands he held a large, high-powered flashlight. He had the flashlight beam pointed out of the open window, trained at the tree-line. Again, I was confused, but I was also tired. My eyes closed again and I slept. I thought little of it in the morning. It is only now, so many years later, that I try to put all the memories together. The next week, Uncle Pete had to make the long drive to the nearest town for his monthly supply run. Buying canned food, replacement tools, fuel for his Jeep. Uncle Pete, unwilling to take me with him, was not fazed by the prospect of leaving a 9 or 10-year-old on their own in an isolated farmhouse. It was a day and a night's journey to town. Pete would be back in the morning, and I would spend the night alone. On the night in question, I had already spent 2 nights on my own like that, in previous months on the farm. I went about my usual routine, making a sandwich for myself, and then turning on the television. It would have been about 10 or 11 at night. I liked to go to bed late when I was on my own. I was glued to the TV screen. I remember there was a light rain and the house was buffeted by low-level but persistent wind. Gradually, above the noise of the television, I began to hear something from outside. I cocked my ear to listen properly, and I muted whatever program I was watching. I wasn't worried yet. You hear all sorts of sounds out in the country at night. I went over to the back door and stepped outside. Immediately, I was hit by a really weird feeling. I can't explain it or even really describe it, but as I stood there, rain trickling down my face, I felt inexplicably certain that something was deeply and terribly wrong. Now I could make out that the sounds were coming from the cowshed, several hundred yards away from the farmhouse. The cows were making a lot of noise. I could hear them mooing and snorting and kicking the corrugated iron walls of the shed. At hearing the commotion from the animals, I began to grow nervous about the possibility of a coyote or even a black bear nearby. I scanned the almost impenetrable darkness of the fields. Then, all at once, the noise stopped. It was as if every cow had silenced at the exact same instant. Now it was just me, standing alone in the silent night. And then, out of the darkness, a voice began to call my name. Meal. The voice was deep and slow, and cracked on each syllable of my name, a shuddering rasp. It mixed with the wind and became almost an echoing howl. I stepped back inside and locked the back door. Then I closed all of the windows and I turned off all the lights in the house. I sat down on the couch in front of the television, catatonic with fear, tears streaming down my face. Once, twice, 3 times that ghastly voice circled the house, still calling out my name. Mimiikakeel. I sat, nails digging into the flesh of my thighs, shaking uncontrollably. For what must have been 15 minutes, there was a deathly silence. I began to wonder if perhaps I had imagined that awful voice. Then, from behind me, I heard a faint, almost indiscernible sound. It was a dull impact against the large kitchen window, the one which looked out over the vast cornfield. Clunk, clunk, clunk. It didn't sound deliberate. It wasn't a noise meant to toy with me or make me turn around. It was an unintentional sound, the kind produced when something large attempts to go unnoticed. It sounded like antlers scraping against glass. There was another agonizing pause, and then the voice again. "It's so cold out here, Michael. Won't you let me in?" Now that the voice was so close, just outside, I could hear how wrong its cadence was. It was utterly alien. It sounded as if the speaker knew what sounds to make, but had no grasp of the words or their meaning, could not produce anything except the correct vocal contractions in the right order. Still violently shaking, but compelled by something deep and unnatural within me, I turned my head to face the window. Where the pale moon should have been, there was nothing. A black silhouette was blocking the window with its form. I was sitting in the dark, but I strained my eyes to differentiate the shape of the figure from the night sky behind it. I could hardly make out anything. I think that it was squatting on all fours, or maybe resting on its haunches. Only the outline of a wide, misshapen set of antlers was unmistakable. The pitiful blue glare of the television gave me just enough light to see that the thing's face, its wet snout, was pressed against the glass of the window. The dim glow allowed me to make out that its skin and hair was stretched out far too tight over its skull. I remember feeling that the shaking was getting worse. I remember black spots dancing across my eyes. I remember nausea and the feeling of falling. I woke up splayed in the middle of the living room floor. I got up, rubbing my head, in time to see Uncle Pete's Jeep appear from the trees and pull up to the farmhouse. I never told Uncle Pete about that night, about the things I heard and saw, partly because I was sure I wouldn't be believed, and partly because I was still deciding if I dared to believe it myself. Christ, I was just a 10-year-old kid. I only had a few days left to spend at the farm. I stuck by Pete's side at all times, and I didn't look out of any of the windows after dark. Thankfully, we didn't go on any walks through the woods. As I grew older, I tried a mixture of repression and denial about my memories of the farm. I never visited again. I think I managed to achieve some semblance of forgetting, however unhealthy or damaging it was to bury my fears. At last, I reached a point where all I would feel was a shiver up my spine and a vague sense of unease whenever I glanced up at a full moon or walked through dense trees in the twilight. That was until a few years ago, when it all came flooding back. Uncle Pete is gone. Some of the people who knew him in town noticed when he failed to arrive for his monthly supply run. When he missed the next one too, they sent someone down to see if the old man was all right, and he was just gone. His Jeep was still in the driveway. There were no signs of a struggle. The house looked untouched. Although the front door was wide open, there were no footprints anywhere around the house or the surrounding fields. Everyone accepted that he must have had a dizzy spell or a fall when walking through the woods. They combed the mountains and forests for miles, but they never found a body. The only clue they ever found, the only thing at all that was out of place or wrong, was a set of cloven hoofprints imprinted in the mud, leading up to the farmhouse and then away again. Everyone dismissed these tracks. I'm the only one who can't stop thinking about why they were found in sets of 2, not 4. I'm the only one who can't stop thinking about what it was that came up to the house on its hind legs and carried Uncle Pete away, far off, deep into the hills and the trees and the dark. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.